At Wexley University, the tension between departments had always lingered under the surface, unspoken but palpable. Among the most prominent was Professor Madeline Whitmore, the indomitable chair of the mathematics department. She was sharp, respected, and known for her no-nonsense attitude about what constituted real academic work. To her, numbers, proofs, and equations stood at the pinnacle of intellectual achievement. Everything else, particularly the humanities, was an afterthought. One crisp fall afternoon, the faculty lounge buzzed with conversation about new hires. History brought in someone fresh this year, said Dr. McIntyre from physics, pouring coffee into his mug. Young, energetic. Dr. Julian Carter. Madeline raised an eyebrow. History, she said, her voice dripping with skepticism. Well, I suppose someone has to teach the bedtime stories. The professors around her chuckled politely. At Wexley, STEM reigned supreme. Funding, prestige, and influence were all naturally allocated to those who dealt with empirical certainties, not subjective interpretations. Moments later, a tall man entered the lounge, carrying himself with quiet confidence. His brown skin, neatly trimmed beard, and intelligent eyes commanded attention. Dr. McIntyre gestured toward him. Speak of the devil. Madeline, meet Dr. Julian Carter. Julian extended his hand, his smile genuine. Professor Whitmore, your reputation precedes you. She shook his hand briefly, her grip firm. Welcome to Wexley. I trust you'll find your footing quickly. History can be a forgiving field. Julian caught the tone but let it slide, offering a polite nod. As Madeline turned away, Julian exchanged a glance with a sympathetic literature professor who whispered, "Don't mind her. Around here, if it isn't calculus, it's considered a hobby." What none of them realized, least of all Madeline, was that Julian Carter's connection to mathematics ran far deeper than anyone could have guessed. The first full faculty meeting of the semester filled the cavernous conference hall. Sciences clustered on one side, humanities on the other. Julian arrived early, finding a seat near the center. As he organized his notes, he sensed Madeline's arrival before he saw her. Her presence altered the room's gravity. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, eyeing the chair next to him. The young professor occupying it quickly gathered his things and moved. Madeline sat down, neatly stacking her agenda papers. "First meeting at Wexley?" she asked curtly. "First here," Julian replied. "Not my first rodeo." Her lips twitched into a thin smile. "Word of advice. These meetings go faster if people stick to real issues. Some departments, you'll learn which, like to waste time." Before Julian could respond, Dean Hargrove called the room to order. Budget updates, enrollment reports, parking complaints. The typical procedural marathon dragged on. When it came to cross-disciplinary initiatives, Madeline straightened in her chair. "The mathematics department has prepared a proposal," she announced crisply, distributing thick packets. "Quantitative reasoning should be integrated into more curricula, economics, business, even some humanities, to strengthen analytical rigor." Julian flipped through the pages, intrigued. "Interesting approach, Professor Whitmore," he said when she finished. "Have you considered embedding historical context into math courses as well? Mathematical concepts didn't develop in a vacuum." Madeline's smile hardened. "Mathematics is universal, Dr. Carter. 2 plus 2 equals 4, regardless of whether it's ancient Egypt or modern-day America." "Actually," Julian said thoughtfully, "the notation, methods, and even which problems are prioritized have shifted significantly depending on culture and era. The Babylonians, the Indians, the Arabs, all contributed fundamentally different views." A quiet murmur of interest stirred among the humanities side. Madeline's cheeks flushed slightly. "Perhaps we can return to the actual proposal at hand," she said coolly. But something had been set in motion. Over the next few weeks, Julian noticed a disturbing pattern. A bright, young black student named Malcolm Hayes stood during every one of Julian's lectures, even when seats were available. Concerned, Julian pulled him aside one afternoon. "Malcolm, is everything all right?" The young man shifted awkwardly. "Back pain, sir." Have you seen the campus doctor? Malcolm hesitated. It's not that kind of injury. His voice dropped to a whisper. It happened in Professor Whitmore's calculus class. Julian's stomach tightened. Tell me. I was slow solving a problem at the board. She hit me with her pointer. Said I needed to wake up my math brain. Malcolm's voice was tight with humiliation. Wasn't hard enough to leave bruises. Just enough. Julian's hands clenched at his sides. That's not acceptable. You know that, right? I need that class to graduate. Malcolm said quickly. Please don't report it. I'm just trying to survive it. Julian agreed, reluctantly, but privately vowed not to let it slide. That afternoon, he crossed paths with Madeline in the lounge. I hear we have a shared student, Julian said casually. Malcolm Hayes. Madeline glanced up from grading. Hayes? The one who can't keep up? Some students are just not mathematically inclined. He's quite engaged in history, Julian said mildly. Maybe the issue isn't his intelligence. Madeline's eyes narrowed. Different fields require different standards, Dr. Carter. Or maybe different students require different approaches. Julian replied evenly. The silent war between them was no longer just philosophical. It had become personal. 3 days later, Malcolm missed calculus again, choosing instead to work with Julian on historical research projects. Furious, Madeline confronted Julian outside the library. You're sabotaging his education, she snapped. Julian didn't raise his voice. I'm giving him back his dignity. If he can't survive calculus, he won't survive the real world. Julian smiled thinly. Mathematics is the real world for you. But for Malcolm, surviving your classroom shouldn't require enduring abuse. They both knew that this skirmish would escalate into something much larger. And it did, spectacularly. The annual faculty achievement banquet. Amid the glittering chandeliers and white tablecloths, Madeline cornered Julian during the dessert service. If you believe historical understanding enhances analytical ability, she said sweetly, prove it. She proposed a public demonstration. Julian would solve an advanced calculus problem, live, before the entire university. The challenge electrified the room. Julian accepted without hesitation. Over the next week, the campus buzzed with anticipation. In secret, Madeline crafted a wickedly difficult multivariable optimization problem, drawn from obscure journals and tweaked to be devilishly tricky. Meanwhile, Julian dusted off old textbooks, practicing complex calculus problems late into the night. It wasn't rustiness he battled. It was rage at the injustice students like Malcolm had endured. When the day arrived, the university's largest lecture hall overflowed with students, faculty, and administrators. Madeline wrote her challenge across the massive whiteboard, the problem sprawling across 3 panels. She turned toward Julian, her face an icy mask. Whenever you're ready, Dr. Carter. Julian stepped forward. He studied the problem for a full 2 minutes, the room silent except for the scratching of pens taking notes. Then he picked up a marker and began. But he didn't use the standard method. Instead, he elegantly transformed the variables, simplifying the dimensions until a solution pathway emerged. Step by step, he moved with the sure-footedness of someone who had lived in the world of mathematics, not merely studied it. 20 minutes later, he circled his answer. The room held its breath. Madeline approached, reading his work carefully. Finally, stiffly, she said, his solution is correct. The room exploded in applause, but Julian wasn't finished. This technique, he said, pointing to a particularly clever substitution, was first developed by Dr. Elbert Collins, a black mathematician whose work was overshadowed for decades. He turned to the stunned audience. Mathematics, he said, doesn't belong to any one culture, any one race, any one class. Every theorem, every method, every proof carries a history. In that moment, Wexley University changed. The divide between real disciplines and soft ones blurred. Madeline Whitmore, humiliated but also deeply shaken, retreated from public view for several weeks. But then, quietly, something extraordinary happened. She began visiting Julian's office. At first, it was under the guise of clarifications about obscure mathematical history. But over time, their conversations deepened. Madeline devoured books on marginalized mathematicians, studied alternative methods, and began incorporating historical context into her lectures. Meanwhile, Julian helped Malcolm not just survive calculus, but excel in by year's end, a joint course. Mathematics Across Cultures and Centuries, co-taught by Madeline Whitmore and Julian Carter, became Wexley's most popular elective. And so, a challenge born of arrogance and prejudice blossomed into respect, humility, and profound institutional change. Because sometimes, the hardest equations to solve are not the ones on the board, but the ones inside ourselves.